So tonight we are in chapter 19, Ezekiel 19. I just want to review a little bit, not big ideas, just little ideas. Remember going back to chapter 15, we have a series of parables or allegories. Chapter 15, Jerusalem is a useless vine. Remember, just good for nothing, good to just be thrown out and burned. And then we had the parable of the faithless bride, how God had done everything for Israel, and yet she became a harlot and was unfaithful to the Lord. Chapter 17, the parable of two eagles and a vine again. And in 18, remember, they had this saying, they had a proverb, and the Lord says, stop saying that proverb. I'll give you a new proverb. Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. And so, here's a proverb, the soul who sins shall die. And that's an important saying. That's an important point, because he's clarifying for every member of Israel, now it's Judah, but for every member of those people, God holds each one accountable for his or her own sins. And that was a distinction that they needed to have. And all of these things kind of flow into chapter 19. So before we look at it, if you want to know what is chapter 19 about, well, it's right up here. Chapter 19, the big idea is it's a prophecy, but it's in the form of a lament. It's a lamentation concerning the end of Judah and the end of the Davidic dynasty. Now, I have to qualify that a bit, because it's not really the end of the Davidic dynasty, because the dynasty is suspended, you might say, because there is coming one, right, who's going to sit upon the throne of David, and that will be Christ. But in this prophetic lamentation, it comes to an end. As far as they knew at that time, this is it. And that's what this is all about. And again, it just fits into these prophecies concerning God's judgment on Israel and on Judah particularly. So that's what this is all about. So as we look through these things, this is where it's all heading toward the end, is the main idea right there. And I put this up, I think I put this up like in the first or second week. Maybe you have this in your notes already. Just a reminder, because we're going to take a look at a few of these people tonight. They're in this lamentation. And that will be helpful, perhaps, as we do so. Now, chapter 19 divides into two parts. If you look at verse 2, what was your mother? A lioness. But if you jump down to verse 10, your mother was like a vine in a vineyard. So you can see it starts off with an analogy, a figurative language for Judah being like a lioness. But then it switches to Judah being like a vine in a vineyard. So let's take a look at this first part, verses 1 through 9. And I'll read verses 1 through 9, and then we'll stop and I'll make some comments. And you take up a lamentation for the princes of Israel. The princes of Israel here represents the kings of Israel, but Ezekiel, the commentators say that he can't bring himself to call them the kings anymore, going back many generations, as it were. They were princes. And so he calls them the princes of Israel, but he's referring to the various kings. And say, what was your mother? A lioness. Among lions she crouched. In the midst of young lions she reared her cubs. And she brought up one of her cubs. He became a young lion. And he learned to catch prey. He devoured men. The nations heard about him. He was caught in their pit, and they brought him with hooks to the land of Egypt. When she saw that she waited in vain, that her hope was lost, she took another of her cubs and made him a young lion. He prowled among the lions. He became a young lion, and he learned to catch prey. He devoured men, seized their widows. He laid waste their cities, and the land was appalled, and all who were in it, all the sound of his roaring, or at the sound of his roaring. Then the nations set against him from province on every side. And they spread their net over him. He was taken in their pit. With hooks they put him in a cage and brought him to the king of Babylon. And they brought him into custody, that his voice should no more be heard on the mountains of Israel. And so we have a lioness who is the mother of Israel. So are we just supposed to see a literal mother here? Probably not. This represents Israel. Israel who gave birth to kings, who nurtured kings, and raised up kings in their midst. And so the mother here would be Mother Judah, who has kings. And so she is a lioness. I'll pause for a moment here. Yeah, I've done that myself. A lioness. And among lions, she crouched. That's a symbol of, being ready, right, to strike. And so this is a lioness who is in her pride, and she's ready to strike. And in the midst of young lions, she reared her cubs. And she brought up one of her cubs. And so this would sort of be like the mother lion, the lioness, choosing one of the cubs to raise up to be a lion. And so that's what she's doing. That would be symbolic of Israel raising up kings, choosing kings. She brought up one of her cubs. He became a young lion. He learned to catch prey, and he devoured men. He's a lion doing what lions do, right? They catch prey, but they not only catch prey, but if you're walking out there, among the lions are going to eat you as well, aren't they? That's what lions do. But here it's symbolic of the kings who go after their prey, being aggressive, devouring their prey, and even devouring people, which is what some of these kings did. And the nations heard about him. He was caught in their pit. So the nations heard about this, and then the nations took action, and they went and caught the lion. They brought him with hooks to the land of Egypt. There's a lot of discussion about the hooks, but they did use hooks to hook the animal, to lead the animal, and they would probably lead him into a cage, so that when she saw that, so what happened then? They took this first lion, who was a cub, to the land of Egypt. Now, this first cub is Jehoahaz. We see him here, 609 BC. He didn't reign very long. And we find this recorded for us in 2 Kings. If you want to turn there, we'll read a few verses. in 2 Kings 23. What did they do with Jehoahaz? They captured him and took him to Egypt. So 2 Kings 23, and we'll begin reading in verse 31. 2 Kings 23. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done. And Pharaoh Necho put him in bonds at Riblah in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem, and laid on the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and talent of gold. And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim the son of Josiah king in the place of Josiah his father, and he changed his name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoahaz away, and he came to Egypt, and he died there. So in this first part of chapter 19, the lioness, Mother Judah, chose a king. Actually, a king was chosen for her, and this king was taken to Egypt. He reigned only for 3 months, but some argue, well, in 3 months, how much praying could he do? How much damage could he do? Well, he was in the train of and the pattern of the wicked kings before him. And so, like the others, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so he was taken to Egypt. And so it says in verse 5, when she saw that she waited in vain, she's waiting, the lioness, as it were, is waiting. All hope is gone, so she took another of her cubs and made him a young lion. And the language here is intensified. He's even worse than the previous lion. He prowled among the lions. In other words, he's sort of taken over the pride. He's now the king lion. He became a young lion. He learned to catch prey. He devoured men. He seized their widows. He laid waste their cities. And the land was appalled, and all who were in it, at the sound of his roaring. What was the name of that movie? I think Val Kilmer was in it, about the Ghost in the Darkness. Did you ever see that movie? Yeah, it's an interesting movie about a lion. And the lion roars, right? And everybody shakes and everybody quakes. Well, that's kind of what's happening here. They were appalled, and all who were in it, at the sound of his roaring. And the nations set themselves against him from provinces on every side, and they spread their net over him, and he was taken in their pit. And with hooks they put him in a cage and brought him to the king of Babylon. So the first was taken to Egypt. The second was taken to Babylon, and they brought him into custody, that his voice should no more be heard on the mountains of Israel. The second cub is probably Jehoiakim. Now, if we were to go back to 2 Kings 23, we read that Jehoiakim comes next, but it seems as though Ezekiel has jumped over Jehoiakim to Jehoiakim. We find this in 2 Kings 24. So if you're still there, or maybe you want to turn back. If not, I'll read a few verses here. In 2 Kings 24, beginning in verse 7. Read a few verses here. The king of Egypt did not come again out of his land, for the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt, from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king. He reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father had done. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up to Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it, and Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon. himself and his mother and his servants and his officials and his palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign, and carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which Solomon, king of Israel, had made, as the Lord had foretold. He carried away all Jerusalem, all the officials, all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen and the smiths, and none remained except the poorest people of the land. And he carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon. In verse 15, the king's mother, the king's wives, his officials, the chief men of the land, he took into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. And so this, in chapter 19, the second cub who becomes a roaring lion is Jehoiakim, who was deported to Babylon. And so we have these two kings, one being taken to Egypt, one being taken to Babylon. And I think that's all that's necessary to say about that in this lamentation, this, as it were, this funeral dirge, this funeral song, lament over Israel. Ezekiel begins by naming these two kings, Jehoahaz and then Jehoiakim. Now, where does Zedekiah come into play? Well, Zedekiah comes into play in the next section, because we move from the lioness and her cubs to the vine and the branches. So your mother was like, this is verse 10, your mother was like a vine in a vineyard, planted by the water, fruitful and full of branches by reason of abundant water. Its strong stems became rulers' scepters. It towered aloft among the thick boughs, and it was seen in its height with the mass of its branches. But the vine was plucked up in fury, cast down to the ground. The east wind dried up its fruit, and they were stripped off and withered. As for its strong stem, fire consumed it. Now it is planted in the wilderness, in a dry and thirsty land, and fire has gone out from the stem of its shoots, has consumed its fruit, so that there remains in it no strong stem, no scepter for ruling. This is a lamentation, and has become a lamentation. So now, as you can see, the imagery shifts from the lioness and the lion cubs, who represent these two kings, to the vine in the vineyard. And notice that it's planted by water. It's fruitful and full of branches by reason of abundant water. Well, who planted Israel? The Lord did, didn't he? He prospered them in every way, gave them every advantage, every benefit, blessed them in every way, and they became fruitful. Its strong stems or branches off of the vine became rulers' scepters. So we have this idea that among the vine there were rulers who the vine gave birth to rulers with scepters. The scepter speaks of a king or a ruler, doesn't it? And it towered aloft. So this vine grew, and it grew upward among the thick boughs. It was seen in its height with the mass of its branches. Now, you see this fruitful vine, and the vine grows upward, doesn't it? Now, commentators say, and it seems like a universal idea, that this represents the pride of Judah. that it grew upward in its hubris and its pride, grew up to the top of the trees, even above the trees, so that everyone could see it. But the vine was plucked up in fury, cast down to the ground. Now, the Lord is the one who is pulling the vine out of the ground. He had planted it, prospered it, caused blessings to flow out of it, and yet, in their pride, they grew up and wanted more and more and be bigger and bigger. And remember how they wanted all of the things of the other nations, etc. And so in his anger, the Lord just reached down, as it were, and plucked up the vine and cast it to the ground. And this is a picture of what the Lord is doing in his judgment to Judah. The east wind dried up its fruit, perhaps a reference to Babylon to the east. The east wind comes and dries up the fruit, and they were stripped off and withered. And as for its strong stem, the one that produced scepters, fire consumed it. And now it is planted in the wilderness in a dry and thirsty land. So it was ripped up in that well-watered place, and it is tossed out into the desert, planted in the desert in a very dry place where it will wither. And this is, in this lamentation, this is a prophecy of what the Lord is going to do to Israel. They had all the advantages. He's ripping them out of the ground, putting them in a dry place so that they can wither. And they will wither. And fire has gone out from the stem of its shoots. Now here, commentators say that this is a depiction of Zedekiah. Zedekiah was the last of the kings, wasn't he? And he himself was evil. He was captured and taken off to Babylon. And fire has gone out from the stem of its shoots. It has consumed its fruit. We see it out of the stock, as it were, came fire from within. Not from without here, but from within. A fire came and consumed it. The fire that was started by Zedekiah to consume Israel, consume its fruit, so that there remains in it no strong stem, no scepter for ruling. In other words, through these four scenes, as it were, we have the two cubs, we have the vineyard, and then we have what happens inside of the vineyard. Through this prophecy, which is in the form of a lamentation, Ezekiel is telling the people, look, this is the end of Judah. Now, we've seen this before, haven't we? Through the other prophecies. This is another prophecy. The prophecies of judgment go all the way through chapter 24. This is just another one along the way. But here it's a lamentation, which probably is meant to depict Ezekiel's own grieving and lamenting over what is happening. And this is the end. This is it. This is the end of Judah. And the end of the Davidic dynasty. There's no stock left to make a scepter. See that? There's nothing there to make a scepter. They're done. It's gone. And so the branch brings the downfall, and this is probably representative of Zedekiah. Now, as I said earlier, we know that this isn't really the end, is it? We know, and one of the commentaries uses the word, it's a suspension. We're going to suspend what's going on. You know, if you're in a golf tournament and it starts to rain, they have to call a suspension. It's not a cancellation, we're just suspending play. Same with the baseball game. You're out there playing, it starts to rain, lightning in the area, they're going to suspend the game. Hopefully they'll be able to play it later. This is a suspension. God pushing pause. But as far as Judah is concerned, remember, Israel's gone. The 10 tribes are gone. There are only 2 tribes left. And, you know, most of them are up in Babylon. Some are down in Jerusalem. But this is it. This is the end. Judah is no more. And there are no more kings. In this whole vine that used to produce, you know, good stock for making scepters, it's gone. No more scepters for you. No more scepters. So that's what chapter 19 is all about. Now, there's an interesting passage in Genesis 49. If you want to turn there, Genesis 49, we see all of these symbols. We see this language in Genesis 49. And we'll look just at verses 9 through 11. Judah is a lion's cub. We're familiar with that, aren't we? From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine, his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He has washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. So this is when Jacob blesses his sons. And here's the blessings being passed upon his sons, specifically Judah. But now this is all coming to an end. At least for now. It's all being suspended until the Son of David comes, who is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who is the Son of David to sit upon David's throne and to reestablish the Davidic kingdom. And so, what do we make of chapter 19? I've taken 3 applications from Block's a book on Ezekiel. 3 applications. Number 1, God's promises to our ancestors is no guarantee of blessings for their descendants. God's promises to, I'll say, the ancestors, our ancestors, is no guarantee of blessings for their descendants. And that's true, isn't it? See, this is one of the problems of Israel. They looked back to the covenant, and they looked back to the fathers. They looked to their ancestors and said, it's all okay. We're in the line, right? We're in the line of Abraham. We're in the line of David. Yes, we're going through a rough patch, but it's going to end soon. And remember, they had this delusion that this was temporary, and if they just, stay strong, very soon God was going to turn this all around, because he always did. But just because God had made promises to their ancestors was no guarantee that he was going to bless them. Remember, in chapter 18, everyone will die for his or her own sins. There's personal, individual responsibility and accountability with God. Another application, and this is a broader application, but it fits as we look at the kings here. The call to leadership is a call to servanthood. Leaders are called to be servants. I think Bloch said it like this: government exists for the people. The people do not exist for the government. It was in God's kingdom as well. God called leaders, and he meant them to be servants. Servants of the people. And they became servants of themselves. And they wanted all of the people to serve them. This is how things got upside down. Because they wanted everybody to serve them. We're the kings. We're royalty. We stand in the line of David. But it is a reminder that when God calls leaders, he is calling them to be a servant. And the greatest example of that, of course, is Jesus Christ, the suffering servant of Isaiah, and the one that we looked at even this morning, Christ, who came. He was the leader of his people. He was the pioneer of his people, but he led them into suffering. And today he continues to lead his people, and he calls all leaders to be servants, something that these leaders of Israel never understood. And finally, he said, the presence of godly people is no substitute for personal commitment. The presence of godly people is no substitute for personal commitment. This is something that Israel did. Instead of taking responsibility and accountability for themselves and their own personal commitment to Yahweh, they looked out at the certain specific leaders, the certain specific godly people, the ancestors and some of the kings and the prophets and they looked to all these people who may have been in their presence and said, well, surely God is with us. And they were using that as a substitute for their own personal commitment to God, to love and obey him. And that's a danger at all times. We may in a church, we may have not just our church, but in any church, you have a few godly leaders, and everybody else can sit on their hands and say, well, surely God's going to bless us. Look, we have some godly people here. What about your own personal commitment? Your own personal love for the Lord and love for his commandments. And so, the presence of godly people is no substitute for personal commitment. Now, each one of these, could be stretched out. There's a lot that could be said about each one of these. I'm choosing not to, but God's promises to our ancestors is no guarantee of blessings for their descendants. The call to leadership is a call to servanthood, and the presence of godly people is no substitute for personal commitment. De Guid, in his commentary, addressed this, maybe all of these, in sort of a long application where, we have ideas about what it means to be blessed by God. We have ideas of what it means to be blessed by God. In Israel, that means, you have kings, you have a kingdom, you have royalty, you have possessions and wealth and power and prosperity. But God just turned all that upside down, and especially in the New Testament. You can't measure success, quote unquote, by outward prosperity. Who are we to say what God counts success for us? Well, success means growth. Well, sometimes the Lord gives growth. But that may not be God's will for every church. Not every church will survive for centuries. They just don't. And there are some churches that, probably needed to die. And there are some who were good churches that just in time, they had to close. It didn't mean they did anything wrong. It wasn't any sin. It just, that's, God, for that church, it was not God's will for them to grow numerically and to continue. We can't say put success in a box or God's calling to a church in a box. And Israel had an idea. They had a box and said, this is what it looks like. And some churches today are the same way. I thought about, I don't know what city or town it was, but on our trip down to Memphis, we passed this giant church. I mean a giant church. Sort of this colonial-looking thing, and like 3 buildings, huge. I can't imagine how big it was, really. It was huge. And it was a Pentecostal church. Prosperity gospel, no doubt, being preached there. And, I'm sure the leadership, they were all wealthy. They're all doing fine. And they're living on the poor people who are giving them everything in faith, hoping that they get a bunch of that themselves. They want a taste of that success. But God doesn't count success the way men count success. Prosperity is, we can't let the world define prosperity or God's will. So I'm just saying we have to be careful of those things, don't we? Well, I'll end there. All right, so chapter 19, what's the big idea? What's this all about? It's a lamentation because of the end of Judah and the end of the Davidic dynasty for that period. And that's why he's lamenting this. It's all coming to an end. So, any comments or